In the heart of Persia's grand palace, where golden pillars rose toward the heavens and royal decrees shaped the fate of nations, a shadow began to grow. It wasn't a shadow cast by armies or foreign powers, but one born from pride, bitterness, and ancient hatred. His name was Haman. Now, to understand the threat Haman posed, you need to know where he came from. Haman wasn't just any official. He was a descendant of the Amalekites, a people with a long and bitter history as enemies of Israel. And somehow, this man had climbed the ladder all the way up to become the most powerful figure in the empire, second only to the king himself. With that kind of power came reverence. The king had ordered that everyone bow before Haman, and they did. Everyone, except for one man, Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew. He was also the cousin and guardian of a young woman named Esther, who, unknown to most, was now queen of Persia. But Mordecai refused to kneel before Haman, not out of stubbornness or pride, but out of conviction. His loyalty was to God, not to men. And Haman? He didn't just take offense, he took it personally. But he wasn't satisfied with just punishing Mordecai. No, his fury boiled over into something darker. He wanted to annihilate all the Jews in the empire. What started as a grudge quickly spiraled into a plan for genocide. So Haman went to the king, spinning a tale laced with fear and manipulation. He spoke of a strange people scattered across the kingdom, people who lived by their own laws and refused to obey the empire. He warned the king that this nation within a nation was a threat. And with that, Haman asked for permission to destroy them. The king, unaware of who these people really were, handed over his royal signet ring, sealing Haman's deadly decree. A date was set. In less than a year, every Jew in the Persian Empire, men, women, and children, would be killed. Word spread like wildfire. Panic and mourning swept through the Jewish community. Sackcloth became clothes, ashes marked foreheads, and prayers rose in desperation. And in the middle of that chaos, Mordecai sent a message to Esther. He urged her to act, to speak to the king on behalf of her people. But Esther was trapped. To go before the king without being summoned was forbidden by law. It carried a death sentence. Unless the king extended his golden scepter, she would be executed, regardless of who she was. For days, Esther wrestled with the decision. Her heart was torn between fear and faith, but eventually her resolve solidified. She told Mordecai, "If I perish, I perish." And with that, she approached the king. Time seemed to freeze as she entered the throne room uninvited. The guards watched, the courtiers held their breath, but then the king raised his scepter. Esther was safe, but she didn't speak out right away. She knew this wasn't just about survival, it was about strategy. Timing was everything. So instead of making her case immediately, she invited the king and Haman to a private banquet, and then another. At that second feast, Esther finally revealed the truth. She said, "If we had only been sold into slavery, I would have kept silent. But we are to be destroyed, my people and I." The king froze. "Who would dare do such a thing?" he demanded. Esther turned, her voice steady and clear. "Our enemy is this wicked man Haman." The silence shattered. The king rose. Furious, Haman dropped to his knees begging for his life. But it was too late. In a bitter twist of fate, the very gallows Haman had built for Mordecai were used instead for him. Justice, swift and poetic. But there was still one problem. The decree to kill the Jews had already been sealed, and Persian law couldn't be reversed. So Esther and Mordecai came up with a bold solution. A second decree. This one giving the Jews the right to defend themselves. When the day of destruction arrived, something remarkable happened. Instead of annihilation, the Jews stood their ground and won. The date marked for their end became a day of triumph. Persia, without even realizing it, had become a fortress, a shield for God's people. And after this miraculous turn, Persia began to fade into the background of biblical narrative. Empires shifted. Time moved on. Babylon fell. Greece rose. Rome took center stage. But just because Persia fell silent doesn't mean it disappeared. Because centuries later, something unexpected happened. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read a line that's echoed through Christmas carols and holiday cards for generations. Wise men came from the east. But who were they? And why did they come?
The Bible doesn't give us much detail about them. Just a simple phrase. Wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." That's it. No names, no camels, no number. Even though we always picture 3. But that one phrase, "from the east," has sparked centuries of wonder. Who were these men? Why did they come so far to find a newborn king in a tiny, occupied corner of the Roman Empire? Let's start with what we do know. The Greek word used to describe these men is magi, which gives us the English word magi. In ancient times, the magi weren't just astrologers or philosophers. They were a priestly caste from the Median or Persian world. Think of them like a powerful, scholarly class, keepers of knowledge, skilled in astronomy, dream interpretation, and ancient texts. In other words, they weren't just curious travelers. These were men of status, advisors to kings, the intellectual elite of the East. Now, here's where it gets interesting. For centuries, the Jewish people had lived in exile throughout Babylon and Persia. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, many Jews never returned to the land. They stayed. They raised families. They built synagogues. And most importantly, they carried their scriptures, the prophecies, the promises, the hope of a Messiah, with them. It's entirely possible, even likely, that the Magi had access to these writings. Maybe they'd studied the scrolls of Daniel, who once served in Babylon. Maybe they'd heard stories passed down through generations of Jewish exiles. Maybe they read the prophecy in Numbers, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." Whatever the path, something had sparked their belief that a king had been born, one not just for Israel, but for the world. And so when they saw the sign, the star, they followed. Now pause for a second and imagine this scene. A caravan stretches across the desert. Dust rises under hoof and sandal. Nights are cold and days are brutal. But these men, wealthy, educated, possibly royal, keep going. Hundreds of miles, weeks, maybe months on the road. Why? Because they believed. They arrive in Jerusalem expecting the city to be buzzing with celebration. A king has been born after all. But instead they find confusion. No one seems to know what they're talking about. Even King Herod is caught off guard. And Herod? He's not thrilled. This is a man known for his paranoia, so much so that he murdered his own sons to protect his throne. The news of a newborn king of the Jews sends him spiraling. So he turns to the religious leaders. They dust off the scrolls and find the prophecy in Micah. "But you, Bethlehem, out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Herod calls the Magi secretly, tells them what he's learned, and then gives them a chilling request. "When you find the child, come back and tell me, so I too may go and worship him."
Of course, that was a lie.
The Magi continue their journey, and then, miraculously, the star reappears. Not just in the sky, but leading them, guiding them to the exact location. Finally, they arrive at the house. Not a palace, not a fortress, just a home. And inside is a child. Not wrapped in royal robes, not surrounded by soldiers, but with his mother, Mary. And what do? They fall down and worship. These men who had access to kings, who likely wore silk and gold and had seen the grandeur of Persia, they fall to their knees before a toddler in a simple home. Then they open their treasures: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gifts rich with meaning. Gold, fit for a king. Frankincense, a symbol of worship. Myrrh, used for burial. Without knowing it, the Magi had foreshadowed the life of Jesus, his royalty, his divinity, and his sacrifice. But before they could return to Herod, they were warned in a dream. So they slipped away, returning home by another route. And then they vanish from the narrative, never mentioned again. But think about it. The first people outside of Israel to recognize the Messiah weren't Romans, weren't Greeks. They were men from the East, from Persia. The very empire that once tried to destroy the Jews now sent its wisest men to bow before the King of the Jews. The irony is almost poetic. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an accident. Because tucked inside this moment is something powerful. The idea that God never forgets seeds planted in exile. That truth carried into distant lands doesn't return void. That generations later, through culture, distance, and time, faith can still rise. That's what happened in Persia. And it's what happens in places that seem quiet, forgotten, or even hostile to God's story. Because God isn't limited by geography or empires. He works in whispers, in wonders, in wise men traveling from the east. While Persian scholars were crossing deserts, let's look at what was going on in the other direction, deep inside the mighty Roman Empire. Rome at this point in history seemed invincible. They ruled most of the known world. Roads stretched from the British Isles to Egypt. Their legions were feared everywhere. Trade, culture, politics, it all flowed through the heart of the empire. But beneath that polished surface, cracks were forming, and they weren't small. See, Rome had recently gone through one of the most chaotic periods in its history, a time known as the Roman Civil Wars. Generals turned on each other. Friends betrayed friends. Political leaders were assassinated in daylight. Julius Caesar himself, the man who reshaped Rome forever, was stabbed to death by senators, including some he considered allies. After that chaos, Caesar's heir, Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus, stepped in. He was brilliant, strategic, ruthless when necessary. Through war and careful manipulation, he defeated his rivals, Mark Antony and Cleopatra included, and took control. But here's the twist. Augustus didn't declare himself a dictator. No, he was smarter than that. Instead, he kept the Senate, the laws, the titles, but made sure all real power flowed through him. He called it a republic, but in reality, it was an empire, with Augustus at the center. And the people loved it.
Why? Because for the first time in decades, there was peace. This period became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade flourished, roads were built, cities expanded, crime dropped. The empire felt stable, prosperous. But let's not be fooled. Peace came at a price. Rome still crushed uprisings with brutal efficiency. Dissent was silenced. Slavery was widespread. The poor were still poor, and the rich, especially Roman elites, were untouchable. And behind closed doors, Augustus had one growing problem: succession. He didn't have a son, so he adopted heirs,
First one, then another. Each time things fell apart. His chosen successors died young or failed to live up to expectations. It was a game of political chess with very high stakes. But maybe the most fascinating part of Augustus's reign wasn't what he did, but how he was seen. Because over time, he wasn't just considered a ruler, he started to be seen as divine. Temples were built in his honor. Statues called him Son of God. Coins declared him Savior of the world. Sound familiar? The same titles that would later be used for a carpenter's son from Nazareth were already being used for Caesar. In fact, Roman citizens began to worship the emperor alongside traditional gods. Augustus became a living symbol of Roman power, order, and destiny. Now, hold that thought, because while Rome was busy declaring its emperor a god, something radically different was happening in a tiny village in Judea. A real Son of God had been born. Not in a palace, but in a manger. Not announced by senators, but by shepherds. Not carried in on chariots, but wrapped in swaddling cloths. The contrast couldn't be more striking. And the irony? While Rome was busy declaring its emperor a god, the Prince of Peace had quietly entered the world. No fanfare, no armies, just a whisper in the night. It's easy to see Rome as the unstoppable force, the center of everything. But in many ways, the empire was fragile. It relied on perception, propaganda, and power plays. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't rely on any of that. His kingdom would be different. Not one of control, but compassion. Not built with swords, but with service. Not maintained by fear, but by love. That's a revolution far greater than any Rome ever imagined. And here's the thing. Augustus never met Jesus. He likely never even heard his name. But centuries later, almost no one names their sons Caesar. And yet millions are named Jesus. The empires that seem eternal rarely are. But truth, that lasts. And sometimes, while the world watches one throne, a greater one is being prepared in the quiet, the ordinary, and the overlooked.
Now, if that were the end of Persia's story, if it had simply bowed out after the wise men's visit, it would still be impressive. But the Bible doesn't stop there, not even close. Centuries before Jesus was born, a prophet named Ezekiel recorded a vision so intense, so mysterious, that scholars still debate it to this day. It's found in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, a chilling prophecy about a future war, a global conflict, the war of Gog and Magog. Now let's set the scene. Ezekiel describes a time in the latter years, a period many believe points to the end of days. In this vision, a coalition of powerful nations rises up against Israel, now restored and living in peace. At the center of this alliance is a leader called Gog from the land of Magog, most often associated with regions in the far north, possibly modern-day Russia or parts of Eurasia. But Gog doesn't march alone. Among his allies, Persia. Yes, Persia, modern-day Iran, is named specifically as a key player in this final uprising against God's people. Other nations in this dark alliance include Cush, likely ancient Nubia, modern-day Sudan; Put, linked to Libya or North Africa; Gomer and Togarmah, regions in modern-day Turkey and the Caucasus. Together, they form a terrifying force, described like a storm, a cloud covering the land, advancing in a massive assault on Israel. But then, God intervenes. And it's not subtle. We're talking about earthquakes that shake the entire world, fire raining down, confusion spreading among the armies until they destroy each other. It's divine judgment on a scale that shocks the nations. And in the chaos, God speaks through action. I will magnify myself and sanctify myself and make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. In short, the world won't just watch this battle. They'll witness God's power firsthand. And Persia, the nation that once freed God's people, that once honored the Messiah, now stands on the wrong side of prophecy. But here's where it gets surprising. Because if that's where Persia's story ended, in fire and fury, it would just be a tragedy. But God isn't done. There's another prophecy tucked away in the book of Jeremiah, almost forgotten. It's about Elam, an ancient region that became part of the Persian Empire. And here's what God says: I will shatter Elam's bow, the mainstay of their might. Yet in the last days I will restore the fortunes of Elam, declares the Lord. Wait, what? Did you catch that? Yes, Elam, Persia, will face judgment, but God also promises restoration. That changes everything, because it means the story isn't just about punishment, it's about redemption. Yes, Iran may play a role in future conflict. Yes, its alliances today may look alarming. But even then, God leaves the door open. That's huge. It means no nation, no history, no prophecy is beyond God's reach for restoration. Even Persia. Think about that. The same land that once raised up Cyrus, who freed the Jewish captives, the same land that sent wise men to worship a baby in Bethlehem, the same land that might one day rise in rebellion, could also one day return in repentance. Because the Bible tells us that in the final days, all nations will flow to Jerusalem. They'll worship the King, the Lord of hosts. They'll celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And among those nations could be Elam, could be Persia. That's the pattern we see over and over again in Scripture. Nations rise, nations fall, but God's mercy remains. Persia's story mirrors ours: redeemed, fallen, judged, and if we choose it, restored. So as we look at the headlines today and we see Iran in the center of global tension, maybe we're watching more than politics. Maybe we're watching prophecy unfold. So now I'll ask you, do you think Iran is playing its prophetic role today? Could we be living in the very times Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jeremiah all pointed to? And if so, how should we respond? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters here. This isn't just history, it's now. And if you found this video powerful, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready to go deeper, click on the next video, Daniel's 7 Keys to Identifying the Antichrist. Because in these times, understanding isn't optional, it's essential. Blessings, and may you walk in truth.